Yeah, so this is being recorded and will be posted online. And yeah, Nick?
Thank you. I guess first things first is to figure out when we're going to talk next. So 2 weeks from now would be December 17th. I know that's starting to get closer to holidays and potential time offs and stuff. Although 2 weeks after that is also New Year's Eve. So I didn't know what people wanted to do for a meeting next. I think in some years past, we've kind of skipped some of the middle December meetings. But if there's any hot topics, we could continue discussing them if enough people will be here, I guess. Any preferences at all?
It's my last work day. I think a lot of us at Google, that's the last work day before a lot of folks are taking vacation. It seems perhaps not advisable to meet with a busy, important schedule. On the other hand, it might be a good time to do some things that are somewhat optional, but on our backlog, and rather than meeting 6 weeks from now.
Right.
So I'm happy to join in 2 weeks.
Yeah, I don't know that we have a ton of things on the issue backlog. So it seems safe to skip from my perspective, unless people have things they want to discuss.
If we were to skip the 17th, would we also want to skip the 31st? I'm assuming that's going to be when people are off.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So I suspect that like bumping the 31st in a week, and then maybe we can readjust the schedule. Would make sense.
Okay. So the 7th, January 7th would be the week after that. So it'd be 5-ish weeks from now. Okay, we'll go with that unless there's any other reason to change it later. Today we have a little bit shorter of a total agenda, but we definitely have some things to talk about. I think David would like to first talk about page visibility in transient states. And then I think we just have one new issue from recently to discuss about resource timing transfer size and HTTP only cookies. So if David is ready, I guess we could jump into whatever you want to talk about.
Sure. So let me just present. Sorry, what's the meeting name?
Oh,
there it
letters.
is.
A-D.
Yeah, I think I got it.
J-I-S-P-P. I'll paste the link
Okay.
as well for others to view.
Okay. Can everybody see that?
Yes, looks great.
Okay. Okay, so hi everyone. I'm David Bocan. I work on the Chrome team, working on some of the pre-rendering changes that we're working on. And you might remember me from the discussion we had around pre-rendering at TPAC. So I just thought I'd come back and give a small update on some of the changes that we're proposing for pre-rendering state. And I'm mostly doing this just to share some visibility into what we're working on and to solicit feedback early in the process. So this is all still super early. We're willing to change course if needed. And then given that pre-rendering is very closely related to WebPerf, and this group previously specified the last iteration of like the pre-rendering visibility state. So I'm hoping to reach some of the right people here. And feel free to reach out to me either today or any other time. I've got my email here in the corner. Either Google or Chromium both go to the same mailbox, so either one's fine. But I'll jump straight to the punchline, and we'll start with the conclusion and then work our way backwards through the reasoning. So this is basically the proposal as I currently see it, and it's different from the visibility state in that it's completely decoupled from visibility. So there's a lot more detail and some of the surrounding context in this GitHub repo we have, and I'll make sure that the links and slides get posted to the agenda. But basically, this repo defines this new concept of a pre-rendering browsing context, and this kind of context places restrictions on documents that are relevant for pre-rendering. So, for example, like you can't window.open, or you can't show alert boxes and things like that. And so this new bit on document would basically just be visibility into whether or not you're in that kind of a browsing context, as well as an associated event handler whenever that changes. So we had a good discussion at TPAC around some of like the early thoughts here, and we got some good ideas and feedback. I decided to take a look at how some of the visibility state, both like the existing ones and then how the pre-render value was used on the web. I've got a doc here you can look at. It's somewhat long-winded and unfocused, but it might help explain how we got to where we are. And it basically boiled down to looking through HTTP archive at some random sample of pages that use visibility state. I pruned out anything that was Google related, since I think we basically know what those are doing. And also we have some agency to change those if we need to. So I was really more interested in like non-Google uses and just like the long tail of the web. And then I also ran over the top 100,000 pages in Chrome's cluster telemetry framework. And so this used a real browser and looked for pages that differed based on whether or not the visibility state reported either hidden or pre-render as opposed to visible. And so this turned up some very useful results of pages that were doing interesting things here. It still required some manual inspection since it was noisy. So the conclusions don't necessarily give you an exact percentage of like how often pages do certain things, but it was really useful to find some interesting use cases and kind of like what the rough frequency is of some of these things.
David, could I interrupt for
Yep.
1 sec? The cluster telemetry work, first of all, fantastic. But how did you constitute different? Was it just visibly different?
So the exact thing I did was I would take the whole page and just run inner text over that, and then basically do a string comparison with some of the kind of common pitfalls removed. So for example, like dates, I would just strip into all zeros and numbers and things like that.
Okay.
But it was any kind of textual differences, really.
So for things like autoplay audio, for example, or things.
So that wouldn't show up there. This did filter out things like differences from just like random ads or images, but then there was some noise for other reasons, and so I would kind of go through case by case and then just look at what the page was actually doing. So from 100,000 pages, that got me down to like a couple hundred, and then I would just kind of go through those and see what was whether or not those were real differences or not. So yeah, the use cases that I found generally broke down into these 5 buckets. So very common that like videos and animations would want to start or stop playing. So in some cases, I did actually notice like animations because there might have been some text or something that that changed there, or just the layout of the page. There's also fetching of large images and resources. So sometimes pages, if they're hidden, they don't want to download like some of the top images. I'm not necessarily sure why they do this. It might just be to save on bandwidth, or it might be that they want to fetch like the latest images when the page comes into view. There's also avoiding measuring of any kind of like user metrics. So ads is a major use case here, but I did also find some ads and analytics libraries that use the pre-rendering state specifically to avoid this. And then there were some features that have some server-side logic. A common example I found of this was like automated chatbots on web pages. So they would want to avoid connecting to a server for those until the web page is actually been navigated to. And you can also think of other use cases like this. So one that comes to mind is like you don't want to start like if you're trying to buy an airline ticket, you don't want to start the countdown timer when it's pre-rendered. You want to start it when the user navigates to the page. And finally, that's not related to, I didn't actually find any use case of this, but I know that we use visibility state as a termination signal So when you become hidden, that's when you want to do any kind of work to like run unload handlers and things like that. So a fair question to ask is why simply not bring back visibility state pre-render? And I think there's three major reasons. The first one is that some of the assumptions around what pre-rendering is, I think, are going to change. So from my perspective, this is mainly due to portals. So the portals proposal, if you don't know, is basically allowing you to show a live preview of a pre-rendered page. So pre-render and visible won't be mutually exclusive states anymore. But even without portals, I think you can imagine similar scenarios. For example, like if you have frequently visited page tiles on a new tab page, or even like some of the app switcher use cases. So we'll get to that later. But basically, reasonable looking code like we have here would now be broken in a preview-like state like that. The second reason is it's not really mutually exclusive with hidden either. So I think this was already a problem in like the visibility state case. But if you're pre-rendered in like the classic sense, you're also technically hidden. So this is less problematic from like the user's point of view, since like if you do have bad code like this, it would just result in the pre-rendered page thinking it's visible. But it might mean that you're doing some wasteful work, or if the page really wanted the user to see like an animation when they visit, the page might load with the animation already finished. It's also less ergonomic for authors to use. So you have to, if you want to really get this right, you'd have to write these kind of cases where like if you're hidden or you're pre-rendered, then you have to do this thing. Where really, if you look at some of these use cases, the ones related to like animation and loading resources, they're really more concerned with whether or not you're on screen. They don't actually care if you're pre-rendered or not. So authors shouldn't really have to reason about these substates. And in this case specifically, you might say like, well, the natural thing here to do would be if visibility state is not visible. But then that gets you back to the broken cases in portals. And it takes us to the next point, which is code like this already exists. And I found plenty of examples of pages that would basically just assume that there's only two visibility states. So this isn't catastrophic, but given that visibility state pre-render has been around for a few years and then it was removed only relatively recently, it does seem like using visibility state for pre-rendering isn't very intuitive. So to summarize, basically every combination of pre-rendering and visibility can occur. So we have basically all the states here. And I think that this is a good reason to split it out into a totally orthogonal state. And given that we're already going to be asking authors to do some work to opt into the new pre-rendering, I think that this is a small and reasonable change. And then the other topic that came up is that visibility state is currently used as a termination signal. So issue 59 in the page visibility GitHub repo has some details on this. But the basic summary is that on mobile, being backgrounded means that the OS might kill you without notice. So we can't run unload handlers. So authors have been told to just use the hidden state as a signal to do any kind of work, like sending out beacons or saving state. And there's some interesting edge cases here that are related to some of the issues that we're having in pre-rendering. So app and tab switchers they're a surface from which the user can terminate the app or the page. And in some of these cases, we can't give the page any execution time when this happens. So I think the solution right now is to kind of lie to the page and just say that actually you're hidden. But in an app switcher, like on iOS or on Android, like we expect that the app should still look and feel like it's alive. So if you open a YouTube page and then like in the native app, if you open a YouTube page and then go into the app switcher in iOS, you'll see that it still plays. You still hear sound, like it still feels and looks like a live app. But if we lie to it and say that it's visibility state hidden, a page that's trying to do the right thing would actually look like it's frozen. So the new pre-rendering bit doesn't really change the status quo here, but I don't think it makes things any worse. When we enter pre-rendering state, so this is something that can happen in a portal, the page, sorry, I lost my train of thought here. Right, when we enter into a portal, Sorry, where am I? Right, when we enter into a portal, I think that this is one of those places where we would actually want to save state. And so having having an explicit state for this, I think, would be a much better solution than relying on just visibility. And so we could also think of like the app switcher or the tab switcher as being a place where maybe pre-rendering equals true might also make sense in those cases. So that's basically everything that I have. And I'm interested if anybody has feedback, whether it's something critical or reasons that this might not work, or just to say that we're on the right track. So there's some links that I've left to the GitHub repo, and I'll make sure that they get added to the agenda. But yeah, that's basically it. Thanks for your time, and I'm happy to answer any questions if you have them.
I have a question. So I like the idea of separating rendering from the visibility state. I wonder if we've thought about exposing the previous pre-rendering history for a script or something. I'm thinking about the current issue we have with visibility states is that if you load the script too late for some reason, basically you may miss data. So the proposed interface has the same problem because it's just basically copy paste from the current interface of visibility state. So what are your thoughts on that?
So this was the case where you basically want to know, have I ever been pre-rendered, right?
Right.
Right.
Seems like an important use case for analytics providers, right?
Right. So I haven't looked too closely into that, and I'd be interested if there are any approaches that you all have thought of, or maybe potential solutions to that.
Yeah, I presented a performance observer-ish kind of solution where basically we would buffer the previous, in this case, visibility history. And then you could just register the observer later and set the buffered flag to true, which would get you the stored previous states. And then obviously they would have some timestamp to say when this happened. And it seems like we may even need both this and the observer thing, because some of the use cases seem to require like pretty quick notification on when the state changes due to like, oh, I want to stop animating something or something like that. Whereas for the use case that I was thinking about, the performance tracking, like it would be fine to just use the observer, which can be a bit delayed into the future or something. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I'd have to consider that. Can you, what's the name of that?
I can send you my slides later. I just presented it to the working group, so it really has no name. I mean,
okay,
or something like visibility state entry. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, I'd be interested to hear about that. I did come across it, and I wasn't sure if it was completely necessary for the pre-rendering case, but yeah, I guess it is a possibility.
Yeah, and for analytics, being able to know whether the page the page had been loaded under a pre-render like state. I mean, it's definitely going to affect the characteristics of the page and kind of how it's presented to the user and everything. So I think from an analytics point of view, it'd be nice to be able to put that into this page had been pre-rendered bucket or not when segmenting data.
Yeah,
And
I think
if you're loading too late, you wouldn't be able to, like many analytics load at onload or later. And if there's only a Boolean of like, what is the current state, we wouldn't know whether it had been.
that's a good point. Yeah, I was going to say that the reason I thought this was less of an issue for pre-rendering was the only way, at least that in our current state, that you could enter pre-rendering is through a portal, which requires a user gesture, which means that like most likely your scripts will be loaded. But if you're loading analytics after page load, then yeah, that would be a problem.
Yeah, third-party analytics for sure. Good use.
And doesn't Safari do already some sort of pre-rendering in the URL bar? So presumably you'd want that to be surfaced via this API as well, right? And I mean, it's not really, I mean, I don't know if you count it as a user gesture for the navigation that hasn't happened, right?
Yeah, I think there's a number of use cases you could imagine using this. So like, yeah, the app switcher is another case where maybe you enter it, and like you might even load into it. So maybe you don't even need a user gesture.
Yeah. David, I have a whole bunch of things to discuss. First of all, I wanted to just start with saying excellent documentation. I'm so glad after TPAC you went and actually did a bunch of the research and all of the charts that you created and the thing. It was great reading through and actually finding a lot of conclusions to the questions that I had. I don't necessarily know where to start. So I think that I, like Nicholas, like the separation of this new type of state from the existing visibility state. I think for all the reasons discussed, we should keep them distinct. I always thought of this as more about being non-interactive than about specifically pre-render. And so I have a few things to discuss on this topic, but I first wanted to clarify, is the pre-rendering signal going to be used for the feature? Like I know Portals has a special type of loading mode. Is it expected that that this is just some signal that's broadly necessary to know, or is it specific to pre-rendering to make decisions about the way you do loading in the like Portal context?
So I think it's broader than Portals. There's two questions there. One was about whether this was really pre-rendering versus non-interactive. And so I've thought about this a bunch because that was the first kind of thing that I thought I went off and thought about. The interesting case there is, like, do you consider a background tab to be interactive or not?
I would say that I consider a background tab non-interactive. And so I know I saw in your naming open questions at the end, you assumed that it wouldn't be. And so maybe that's a discussion worth having. But I assumed that the mental model right now is you are either interactive and visible or non-interactive and not visible. And there are cases that were brought up where actually you are still visible but no longer interactive. And so that was there was a separate request to add a non-interactive mode for those cases. And I think you listed them out. And so being not visible is just further down the path of still being non-interactive. That was my mental model.
So the problematic case there is for things like analytics, where if it loads into a background tab, like for all intents and purposes, that's still like a live page. And so we need some signal to discriminate that from really like the user hasn't clicked on the link. We don't want to do anything that would imply that the user has intentionally navigated to the page.
If a tab is loaded in the background from initial state, you mean?
Yeah, so like consider like control clicking on a link.
Yeah, correct.
And then it just loads in the background, right? So today we want to do all the analytics scripts and like measure ad impressions and things like that. But we don't want to do that if the link was just pre-rendered by the browser.
So you would still have the visibility signal, and I mean, it is interesting where you would have to choose on visibility false that you do want to think. Like, is this true that analytics and things do want to report for visibility false?
Yeah. So for example, ad measurements will still happen, but they'll make a note that the page was hidden until you show it. So I think the important thing that they want to measure is whether or not the page was intentionally loaded, rather than whether or not it's visible or whether or not it's interactive.
So there is a distinction conceptually between a pre-render, which was automatic. That's really the distinction there. And so the second clarifying question I wanted to ask was, I think in one of your documents, you talk about portals being able to, I forgot the word, but being able to like adopt the current visible. Yeah, the predecessor. So you could go from pre-render to visible, back to pre-render, back to visible. And some of the hooks you discussed where you might want to start firing timers or something like that and delay until the initial visibility state actually toggles from pre-render. Like, it seems like you would want to make distinct the very first pre-render state from all subsequent non-interactive states, even in that mode. Like, does it really make sense to go back into pre-rendering mode?
Why would you want to distinguish them? There's certain things that you would only want to do if you load into that mode. But
I was just thinking, exiting pre-render seems like something that you should only be able to do once. Like, even in the way like portals load, if you adopt the previous visible thing, is it going to be more like a BF cache, or is it going to be more like a pre-rendered page?
I think it's going to be more like a pre-rendered page, because it might still be able to run scripts, and it might still be able to do things like animate and show content.
Got it.
But you do want to put all those restrictions back onto it.
Right. Yeah, so this is why it feels like it's a visible but non-interactive state, the very first of which is pre-render. And so it feels like there's layers of different meanings, and we could reuse them, but I wonder if it's really enough to just have one.
There's a couple of overlapping like meanings that we want here, and so interactivity works for some things but doesn't work for other things, and then this sort of like intentionally loaded versus not intentionally loaded is another thing. I find pre-rendering just a lot easier to think about. But yeah, I'm not even sure that pre-rendering is the right name for this, right? Because if you do get put back into a portal, it's not really pre-rendering. It just kind of evokes.
Similar with App Switcher, where it's visible. We want it to continue updating. We still have it. It is in some cases able to execute script, but to call it in pre-rendered mode feels awkward.
I've been thinking preview might be a better name for it, but it might be a little bit too early to bike shed on the name.
Yeah. It's less about the name, more I was just trying to see, is it indeed specific to the act of pre-rendering, or is it just any of these types of modes? Like, could we have one single mode, but I'm hearing there are some cases where there is a distinction.
Yeah, I think so. The background page in particular is a tricky one for me, because of like ads and analytics want to be running in a background page, but they don't want to be running in a pre-rendered page.
Yeah, I mean, they would have that signal, but it does seem like an awkward matrix, like, because they would have the visibility hidden.
They would have visibility hidden in both, though, right? Like, if you're pre-rendering, you're still hidden.
Right, because pre-rendering could be either visible or hidden, and so you want... Right.
Yeah, but that would be, so a background page would be hidden, but interactive. Even though the user is not interacting with it, but the page is, so maybe interactive is not the right word, but it's alive compared to one that isn't.
David started by asking that question, and I suggested that my mental model was that background tabs are not interactive, but now I understand why they would need to be.
Or maybe interactive is not the right word, but yeah,
figuring out the terminology here is a little tricky.
Intentional, I don't know. It's not a browser mediated cache of sorts.
I think it's hard to capture in one word. Like, if you can use a whole sentence and like something that the user will likely interact with soon, or
but besides the terminology, like, is the main use case then to enable this kind of intentionality tracking about the navigation, or?
Yeah, I think so. So like the main cases I've been looking are things like analytics, and also those like server side type features, because I think that those are really the driving use cases for needing to know that you're in a pre-rendered state. Whereas a lot of the other use cases really are captured by like whether or not you're visible.
And then, so in that case, I guess my question is, do you really need to have like, it starts not intentional, then moves to intentional, and then from that, can it move back to not intentional? Like, does that have any use case whatsoever.
Yeah, so that's the portals use case. And like the thing we're thinking there specifically is you can imagine like a carousel of articles or something where you swipe to the next article and then that activates the portal. So now that's the main page, but you want to be able to swipe back to the previous article. So you adopt that as a portal. And so then it enters like this pre-rendered state, but that's kind of why I mentioned it's not really pre-rendering at that point, but we want to apply all those same restrictions to it. Like it shouldn't be able to request permissions. It shouldn't be able to show dialog boxes and things like that.
Oh, so you're saying you can have a portal that becomes the main frame, or I don't know how you call it, and then but it can then go back to being the same portal as before. Like it's not even navigation; it's literally the same. Like it remains in memory, stuff like that.
Yeah, it would remain in memory, yeah, it's not quite a navigation, but it's similar. A lot of these things are still kind of under discussion of exactly how they'll work. But yeah, the idea is that what the active pages might change, and even though you might be the active page now, you might become a portal.
Right. You have your muted.
Yeah, sorry about that. Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yep.
You mentioned like about to terminate case that we're currently using visibility hidden for, but it's weird and doesn't work great in many edge cases. And so your thoughts there are to add yet another state so like another signal of you're gonna be terminated soon, or is that out of scope from what you're discussing here?
So I think it's somewhat related. So it's not what I'm primarily looking at, but I think mainly I just wanted to make sure, one, we don't make the situation any worse than it is, and that two, there is like a plausible path to actually make it better. So I think the problem right now is that because we're using visibility state as that signal, it kind of interferes with those cases like the app switcher, where we might have to lie in order to get termination state, but then we lose like nice UI affordances. And so I think that the right path there is not even necessarily like an explicit state that you can query, but just an event that you get, and then the browser can be in charge of when to dispatch that event. And I think that that's a lot cleaner because we know semantically that that's what the app is going to run some sort of a cleanup state in that event, and so we'd be free to move it around. So today, like on Android, if you don't get any functionality from the operating system to run any more code when the app is terminated from the app switcher, then we would just run it when it becomes hidden. But if in the next release of Android, they say like, okay, now your app will get a signal and it can run some more code, we can stop calling it on hidden and then just simply dispatch that event when the termination happens.
Yeah. Makes sense. Yeah. The main hurdle I see is just like avoiding the XKCD situation where we currently have 17 different dismissal events. Let's add a new one that will be better, and then we'll have 18.
Yeah, so I did worry about, like, especially because this is the advice we've been giving web authors for the last couple of years, is just use hidden. But I think the nice thing is hidden still will mostly work. So if all you do is just run some cleanup code in hidden, like that'll work in 95% of cases. And then if you find it's really problematic that you don't get called when you get killed from the app switcher, then you can just add a little bit more code to make that case work too.
I mean, actually, I don't even know if developers right now follow the advice to use hidden, just because it's not as reliable as it should be in any case, right? So like many analytics, they just use like unload or something different.
Well, on mobile, unload should be less reliable than hidden, right? Yeah, I don't have any data here, but yeah, as far as I knew, like,
oh, I didn't mean unload. I meant on load. Sorry.
Yeah, they just report really early, like basically without waiting for the end of the page lifecycle.
Yeah,
They,
page load,
yeah.
not the
I think some of the unreliability of visibility was just due to like implementation, lack of implementation. Some of it was due to disagreements on like exactly this like preview mode during App Switcher, where at least on Safari, they were uncomfortable claiming that the page was not visible. And so with this new mode, I wonder if the very first advice we could give is check for visibility hidden or this preview mode to save state. And I don't recall your table of like matrix of options, if that would actually work. Like, are there cases where you don't want to save state yet if you enter preview mode?
So yeah, I think that's actually, I did mention that right here. So yeah, basically the idea was like maybe having like this new event, maybe that could just be syntactic sugar for you entered hidden or you entered pre-rendering.
Cool.
So yeah, I think that would work.
Yeah. So while I think it's cool that we could have an explicit signal that addresses the specific use case, and then it could grow to support things like will kill proc. I worry that will kill proc will never be reliable. Like, I know that already for native apps, it's not fully reliable because there are times where the system can give you some amount of time to save state, and there are times where you can't. And so I don't know if the suggestion on like at least native is to like basically trust that signal. If truly the system is under such pressure that you shouldn't just try to save more often earlier. But anyway, I don't know if developers would actually adopt it if they found it still unreliable. And so I don't know if it's a bit speculative to think that this would be a thing. And if you could do just or with visibility and pre-rendering, then it seems like you could, under the assumption that a single pre-rendering / like intentional or non-intentional preview mode is all we need, is the one signal that handles all of the different options here. Yeah, but interestingly, I at first thought that maybe the advice would be switch from visibility to this signal. But if background tabs are not always in this state, then you would need an OR. But that actually makes the transition easier because you just now need to handle another case to make it a little bit more reliable as opposed to changing wholesale.
Yeah, which I think is encouraging because you don't have to tell people like completely switch off all the stuff you've been doing.
And then I had a question about BF cache. I think you addressed it, which is BF cache is entirely different. It's not some sort of non-interactive mode. First of all, this isn't a non-interactive mode, but then also things in preview mode get limited privileges, but more escalated privileges than a BF cached page.
Yeah, so it's not entirely clear to me, but I think this is like the most recent thinking is it wouldn't be in this state. A BF cached page, I think, is completely frozen, so it couldn't really query this state anyway. You could consider sending it an event like this, but I think like the on freeze and on resume events are much better suited for it.
Yeah, I think there's page show or something for when BF cache occurs.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a whole lifecycle APIs.
Pretty separate from this one, yeah.
Until we get little app previews when you hover over the back button.
Yeah, I mean, having these kinds of abilities, I think you could then make a case for like, well, maybe a BF cache should use a pre-rendered browsing context. And in that case, I think you would just have to make sure that it conforms to like all of the guarantees that we make about what is a pre-rendering browsing context. So it should all just work if that's the direction we would go, I think.
Yeah, but basically as like a standalone BF cache doesn't have to do with pre-rendered because it's kind of different.
Yeah, today BF cache just like shuts off the page and puts it into like sort of a freeze-dried state. Anyone else? Okay, if not, thanks very much, guys. This was a very useful discussion.
Thank you, David. Great discussion. We only have one other thing on the agenda for today, which is a resource timing issue number 238, and I'll post it in the chat if you want to take a look. This was one that was open last week around transfer size and how it might reveal the presence of HTTP-only cookies. I think it was open, from Anna. I don't know, Yov or somebody else want to chat about it a little bit?
Sure, I can do that. Essentially, it came up when talking about, I believe, transfer size in the service workers working group. And Anna raised a very good point that the current definition in revealing the headers, so basically transfer size minus the encoded body size gives you the size of the headers, which includes the cookies, which is bad. And it's bad regardless of timing allow origin, because it can also reveal the cookie. So cookies are something, and HTTP only cookies are something we don't want to reveal to web content, even in same origin contexts. So there is no, essentially the fact that we're using timing allow origin for that opt-in and cross-origin contexts doesn't help the same origin contexts. So I think that what we should do is simply define that transfer size does not include cookies and drop that bit altogether. And we could essentially, like, we could go beyond that and exclude headers entirely. I don't know if that, like,
Isn't
but
that just
I
true
think
for
cookies are
body
special
size?
enough for us to, like, I'm not aware of any other issues with exposing the header sizes beyond cookies, and cookies are special enough in very different, like many different ways that, you know, maybe like they deserve their own exclusion, and other headers are most probably fine.
So I guess we should talk about what would be the use cases for knowing the header sizes outside of cookies. Like, is it maybe to detect cases where websites are sending ginormous headers and probably causing performance issues to the page due to that, or?
Yeah, I think that's a big one. And, you know, one of cookies are often one of the bigger culprits of that, right? So that was one of the
Yeah, but that's the problem, right? If you can't do the cookie part, then it's
Yeah.
kind of a half-baked solution, and then like it's not
'Cause
clear if
there's not much else, or is anything else, I guess, from headers that is really like linked.
One thing that I can think of is, for example, properties sending debugging information. So various like X/headers that bloat up the responses and are there by mistake, and that may enable them to catch that. But I don't know that this is something that, like, I don't know, like, Nick, is this something that you're currently flagging? Is this something your customers care about?
We independently report transfer size, and I think, I can't remember honestly if it's encoded body size or decoded body size, through our dashboards. So customers could like look at and compare the values to see if there is a major difference between them. But we don't have any like specific reports that are like, this is your largest header, you know, resource or anything like that. It's more of a manual thing that our customers could do. I'm not entirely sure if there's been any specific analyses from our customers, because they do have access to some of the raw data. So there might be some customers that use some of our data science stuff to like look at those kinds of things outside of our dashboards. but we generally just, I think most of the customers that report on this data report on the total transfer size because they're looking for something like a page weight, which has its own issues separate of this topic. But yeah, if we were to go down the path of removing cookies from transfer size, it could cause some confusion until like all browsers are doing that and or comparing older browsers and newer browsers. Like I wonder if we would, I don't know, have some sort of way to know whether that size includes cookies or not.
Yeah.
Just from a kind of a comparison and compatibility point of view.
Yeah. Michael?
Sorry, it's just off topic. I am woefully under prepared for this topic, so this might be an embarrassing question, but I figured I'd ask. What about, is it not the case that modern, like HTTP 2+, the headers can be compressed and that transfer size is like over the wire size? Is it actually the case that we could remove the size of cookies or even answer the question, how large were the cookies themselves? At least in all cases.
So you can't, so on H2, the headers are compressed, but they are compressed in a very specific, like it's not just let's apply gzip and forget about that. They are, so the header names are compressed based on a table of mostly predefined values, although there are always new ones that are not in that table. And then you have basically references to past instances of those names or values, but they have to be completely identical. So essentially, we can split it out. I don't know, like it's possible to say this response's headers took this amount of bytes and exclude the cookies from that. I don't, if like implementation wise, I'm not sure how much of that information is communicated outside of the network stack, but it seems feasible to implement that in H2 and H3. At the same time, if we don't have a clear use case for the header sizes, maybe it makes sense to drop transfer size altogether and then move people over to encoded body size. That is clearer and has, simpler semantics than, headers, but without cookies. And like, maybe it's worthwhile for us to try to gather use cases for headers without cookies and see if people chime in with interesting stories of what they did with that data. And if that did not happen in the last few years, then maybe it wasn't meant to be.
Yeah, but right now we're exposing the headers with the cookies, right?
Yes.
So
I think Yoav asked at the beginning, should we expose all headers without cookies or just remove all headers, I think, correct, Yoav?
Yeah.
And if it's difficult to remove cookies because estimating their size is complicated, then maybe the easier alternative is just to remove everything, like the whole header.
So yeah, so my motivation is less the ease of implementation, although it's definitely a factor. But the question is, are people looking in the wild at transfer size minus encoded body size and doing something interesting with that data? I agree with Nicholas that it's not going to give us, maybe people are using that to detect bloated cookie headers that this information will no longer be available for them. But I'm not sure that people are even doing that. And if they are, it can still potentially be interesting. But if no one is looking at it, then yeah, maybe it's not worthwhile to preserve. And that would also solve the problem of transfer size changing semantics mid-flight.
My only concern, I think, is that removing the headers, like the count of bytes of the headers, moves us further away from like a total page weight being able to be calculated. And we already have some issues with that. And so like if you're looking at your dev tools and you see, you know, 1 meg transferred, and for whatever reason, your RUM tools are only going to report 800K or whatever because the headers are so big, it just starts, it gets us further away from the numbers.
Yeah. So maybe we can take 2 action items out of that. Yeah. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
I had a question because in this comment, Ryosuke says that this is one of many reasons Safari WebKit doesn't expose transfer size. So I'm wondering what are the other reasons that there's blocks on transfer size with WebKit? And if, along with the other point that you're making, Rob, is like, is this really a move towards encoded transfer size where we deprecate transfer size? Like, is there something that we can clearly communicate about production and what we should be using for users?
I agree that it would be good to get clarifications from Safari what they would like, because they haven't implemented encoded body size either. So what would make them comfortable implement transfer size, or maybe they won't, and maybe, yeah, you know, there are no clear use cases, but there are clear use cases for encoded body size. So what would get them to implement it as well? I agree that it's a good question. Unfortunately, Ryosuke and Alex did not make it here today, so we can maybe take that
I'll ask in the Bugzilla. I'm curious.
Awesome, thank you.
The other thing is we already have a open problem with such sizes, right? Because as was mentioned, we want to move away from relying on timing allow origin for those.
Yeah.
So that is at least one of the issues.
Yeah.
They say they have many issues. I don't recall them expressing those issues, so hopefully Benjamin can extract the issues that they have out of them.
Yeah, so going back to the use cases, so one thing would be to just ask people whether they use this information to get interesting insights. The other would be maybe we can start counting in Chrome or other browsers the difference, like what's the weight of headers in total if we remove cookies from that? And if that weight is very small in aggregate, then it's not interesting information. But if it is, you know, can be small or large, then it's something we, you know, will be more motivated to flag to people. And yeah, if that makes sense.
It makes sense to me. One just really quick clarification on how you might actually be able to detect HTTP only cookies. Is it like you would look at document.cookie and compare it to the transfer size, but then you have to know the other header sizes? Like, I guess, how would you actually use this?
You can basically, you see the headers, like you send out fetches and you see the headers coming in, but I believe HTTP only cookies are stripped. before the response makes it back. If I'm not 100% sure on that though. But
Okay.
yeah, that's a good point that we need to like clarify what the attack scenario would look like.
Yeah, I was thinking in my head, there was like, oh, you can compare the size of document.cookie to like the transfer size, but the transfer size also includes obviously all the other headers that are being transferred too. So I'm not sure. So I can ask for clarity on that.
Yeah.
Because I didn't see it as the Bugzilla.
Yeah, that would be good.
Can I ask a quick question? This is not about header size, although I will say we've never actually looked at that. So removing the cookies from that wouldn't matter so much for us. But this is more from our last meeting about transfer size when the service worker is involved. You all were saying that there might be a path forward with integrating the response object into the processing model.
Yeah.
I was just curious, what does that path look like? And I ask because this is something that our team has been trying to do, is to get a cache hit rate when the service worker is involved. And we've had some workarounds, but it's been kind of messy.
The path mostly involves fetch integration for either, like, ideally the full resource timing processing model, but at the worst case, basically have resource timing operate on the response object, and then continuing to like extract the values from the response object, because essentially service workers end up like returning a response, and that response object contains the values for the encoded and decoded body size already. It doesn't contain transfer size, but yeah, maybe removing it altogether would be also simplifying that processing model. But essentially, we hope to integrate the specs with fetch and then use the response object in order to, like, everything just falls out of that.
Gotcha. Is there like a place where we can see the timeline of that path being moved forward on?
I don't have like it's just essentially there's no public timeline for that, unfortunately.
Okay.
It's work. People need to do that work. I am trying to get people to do that work, but
Got it.
Yeah.
All right, a couple follow-ups from there. Thanks everybody for commenting. That's the end of our time. We decided we would meet next again in January, so January 7th. I guess I'll see everybody then.
Yeah. Happy holidays.
Thank you.
Cheers, folks.
Cheers.